I think both of you gentlemen are not strangers to this group, but following the tradition of Dr. Trim, I'll just mention introductions for all four now of our presenters. Jerry Moon is the professor and chair of church history at the seminary, graduating from Union College, spent 11 years in pastoral ministry, and he earned his PhD in Adventist studies from Andrews University in 1993 with his dissertation on the topic of Ellen G. White and W.C. White, her son, their relationship between the prophet and her son. The Trinity, he also co-authored that with Woody Whidden and John Reeve, and as we all know, he is the co-editor for the Encyclopedia of Ellen G. White. Denis Fortin, you know, has been most recently dean at the seminary. Before that, serving in many capacities at the School of Religion, has his doctorate of theology with a dissertation on the development of 3 Adventist denominations in Canada. He has authored a number of publications, articles, and a book called Adventism in Quebec. And again, also co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Ellen G. White and with Jerry Moon. Following their presentation, Michael Campbell, whom I have known since a student at Southern Adventist University, he'll be presenting his paper. He is the professor and teaches at IS in the Philippines. Formerly spent 6 years as pastor in Colorado and Kansas, and before that as director at Loma Linda of our White Estate branch office and in the Department of Archives, Special Collections. Written numerous articles, and is publishing, is it out yet, your study guide on Adventist history?
Supposed to arrive by FedEx today.
FedEx today by okay, and study guides for small groups on Adventist history and Ellen G. White. Benjamin Baker, colleague of mine around the corner in archives, assistant archivist at the General Conference Archives, graduate of Oakwood, also of IS and of Howard University, where his doctorate in history focused on the work that he would do in his dissertation on Ellen White and her attitudes to race, the relationship between her and black people, African Americans. He has authored or edited 5 books, 3 dealing with Ellen White. And I would add, he also keeps the archives website humming with photographs, facts, and the use of social media. Quite an active place. Just a word about myself. I'm the vice director of the Ellen G. White Estate. Jim Nix, our director, sends his greetings. He's recovering from some hip replacement surgery over the holiday break, so he wishes he could be here, but he extends his greetings, and I do that on his behalf. We had Denis and Jerry.
Okay. Well, this presentation is entitled The Inside Story of the Ellen G. White Encyclopedia. I thought it's actually pretty cool that that the 3 of us can all be together here by Skype. Denis and I, co-editors, and Michael Campbell, the assistant editor. And Michael was on campus for about the first 4 years of the project, and then he moved elsewhere. And but now we're reunited as it comes out again. And I had prepared the presentation today because Denis was not going to be able to be present, but now we're both present on the same in the same media. So I'm going to read the presentation I prepared, and then at about 3 different points I'm going to pause and let Denis make some comments in addition to what I have here. This is a story of the Ellen G. White Encyclopedia. Perhaps the review of how this project came to fruition will be encouraging as well as instructive to others who also work at the challenging process of research and writing for publication. I've divided the narrative into 3 parts. 1, the vision, imagining a new reference work. 2, the process, how the vision became reality. 3, the outcome, the product and how it differed from original projections. In the last 3 decades, Ellen White scholarship has come of age with the publication of 2 CD-ROMs, duplication of original sources in many locations, many other research aids, and a growing corpus of secondary sources. Scholarly works have been produced on many different aspects of her life, writings, thought, and influence. Missing, however, from this lineup of scholarly resources is a single-volume authoritative reference work in which one may quickly and easily find both basic facts and scholarly essays about Ellen White, her career, writings, and theology. This volume will fill that need. Some of the articles will indeed break new ground, but the encyclopedia's first purpose is not so much to break new ground as to systematize the entire Ellen White knowledge base as it has developed so far. The encyclopedia will have significance for both Adventists and non-Adventists, since Ellen White, whether one accepts her claims or not, is a significant figure in American religious history. Anyone who's tried to find out even very simple information about Ellen White discovers that it's not always easy to do so. The widespread accessibility of her writings on CD-ROM and the proliferation of voices setting forth a variety of claims regarding her history and her writings makes even more necessary an accessible reference work on Ellen White. George Knight was the one who first caught the vision. He saw the C.S. Lewis Encyclopedia and immediately thought, why not an Ellen G. White Encyclopedia? George envisioned it as the standard reference work regarding Ellen White, written for an audience that would include scholars, students, lay people, and the general public. He imagined it organized in 2 major sections, general articles and alphabetical entries, featuring signed and peer-reviewed articles with bibliographies written as far as possible by specialists in the various topics, but using language accessible to a general audience. Skimming the indexes and tables of contents and existing works on Ellen White and Adventist history, Knight began a tentative list of articles needed. He promoted the idea to the Review and Herald and set about securing the cooperation of the White estate. This was where the project stood in the fall of 2000. Then as Knight began to plan for retirement, he realized that he had on his bucket list some 60 proposed books to write or edit. In prioritizing those titles, he realized that the Ellen G. White Encyclopedia would be primarily an edited work. That meant it could be delegated to others. Thus it was that on November 7, 2000, George Knight met with Denis Fortin and me and asked if we would be willing to co-edit the proposed E.G. White Encyclopedia. Knight would stay on as consulting editor, but would turn over to us the editorial responsibilities of choosing and contracting with the publisher, recruiting the authors, editing the articles, and seeing the project through to completion. For one whose major field was Adventist and Ellen White studies, that's me, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I was then editing Andrews University Seminary Studies. I had no idea how I would reorganize my schedule to make room for editing an encyclopedia. But whatever it took, I wanted it, and I told George so. Denis agreed, and George's vision became our vision. A peer-reviewed, 1-volume encyclopedia that would make accessible to both specialists and general readers all the current scholarship on Ellen White. Okay, Denis?
Part of our philosophy to prepare the document, this 1-volume encyclopedia, was that we wanted to have a book that would be friendly toward Ellen White, and also at the same time to be honest and candid about the issues that are facing Ellen White studies today. That was a basic philosophy that we had from the start when we approached authors, when we approached articles that were written. We wanted both at the same time, as much as we could, trying to get a book that would be friendly, and then at the same time candid and honest. So a fair number of articles are trying to do exactly that. In some of the very difficult issues that we deal with the writings of Ellen White, issues, for example, of plagiarism or the scientific statements that she makes, or any of the others, interpersonal conflicts that she may have had with people. We have tried to be both at the same time, friendly and honest regarding these issues. Another idea that came into our mind also as we prepared the volume was that we wanted this book to really fit in well in the current 19th century women, religious authors, and denominational leaders. It's a field of study at the moment that a lot of people are concentrating upon and trying to study these women in the 19th century who founded denominations. And we saw that this book could really fit well within that kind of scholarship. And hopefully the book will be marketed to non-Adventist colleges and universities as a reference book to be put in their libraries. And hopefully it will really open up the work here regarding Ellen White and at least making her better known to a lot more people. So those were two basic philosophical approaches we had in the construction of the book.
Second part here is how the vision became reality. Denis and I began immediately setting aside a block of time every week to get together and push the project forward as fast as possible. Later on, we gradually developed some role differentiation, but for the first 6 months at least, perhaps the first year, we simply met together and made all decisions jointly. Then we went and worked for a week, and then we'd come back and spend another couple hours reviewing what we did and planning the next week. During 2001, we completed a list of some 870 articles, plus 160 C references, for a total of about 1,030 alphabetical entries. This gradually grew to about 1,200 over the course of the process. We produced a prospectus, author's guidelines, a list of abbreviations, and wrote sample entries. On George Knight's advice, we decided that articles would be not only signed but remunerated to give authors incentive to do their best work. The pay scale was sacrificial, 3 cents a word, but for a 1,000-word article, it would be better than nothing. All the authors will receive a copy of the encyclopedia, and those whose remuneration amounts to more than the cost of one copy will receive the rest in cash. These honorariums will be deducted from the royalties. We considered proposals from 2 different publishers and eventually negotiated a contract with Review and Herald. We sought authors who met most, if not all, of the following criteria. Scholarly credentials, preferably a doctorate, specialized knowledge of Ellen G. White studies, evidenced by recognized research and publication, diversity, a broad mixture of international and multicultural representation, and balance, authors who represent mainstream Adventist thought and have balanced views on the assigned topic. And in a few cases where an author was a leading specialist in one area but held non-representative views in another area, we might assign topics in the former area but not in the latter. Networking with other scholars, we carefully sought to match topics with authors who had already demonstrated expertise in these areas. This was time-consuming, but the quality of the volume would be largely determined by the selection of authors. Allocating the most challenging and lengthy topics first, we assigned about 485 articles during the first 14 months. And we secured a PhD student, Michael Campbell, as a graduate assistant who worked 15 hours a week, and at that time we hoped would be with us till the project was finished, though we had no idea how long the project was going to take. We entered the second full year of our project with high hopes. During that year, we planned to assign the remaining articles, write the articles we had assigned to ourselves, and begin editing the articles written by others. By January 15, 2003, we would have 100 pages assembled and edited. During the rest of 2003, we would finish 50 additional pages per month for a total of 700 pages by the end of the year. In January 2004, we would turn in the completed manuscript to the Review and Herald to be released in the summer of 2005 at the St. Louis session of the General Conference. However, we were unable to meet those projections. For a time, we appeared to be keeping up. We had divided the manuscript into 7 alphabetical sections of approximately 100 pages each and had perhaps 75% of the articles in. As fast as we could edit them, articles were added to the respective sections. The editors and assistant editor, Denis Fortin, Jerry Moon, Michael Campbell, were generating lots of adrenaline in our race with the calendar. But sometime in 2003 or early 2004, we began to find more than the usual number of mistakes in our work. Corrections of edited articles were not always being entered in the most recent version, so that errors from older versions of an article were being perpetuated. Fortin initiated a filing system in which each file name ended with the date in year, month, day order. That is, for today it would be 2013-01-06. When versions of the same title were dated in this format, the computer would automatically keep them in chronological order, virtually eliminating the problem of knowing which version was the last. So we all adopted this format. That helped. But larger causes of increasing errors were hurry and fatigue. In staff meeting, we decided that accuracy was more important than early publication. We consciously decided to slow down, double-check everything, and take whatever time was needed to do excellent work. The motto became, we only publish once. If it's well done, we'll all be happy, but if it's not well done, we'll always regret it. With that decision, we accepted the small disappointment of not being published in 2005 in exchange for the opportunity to do our very best on the volume. And that's how our 100-meter dash became a marathon. Another development that came out of this reorganization was that by common consent, we looked to Fortin as the administrator on our editorial team. After all, he was the dean of the seminary and obviously had that gift. And I've suggested that Denis could make a few comments here about the organization as going forward.
I think what, perhaps just a very simple insight just to give here at this point, is that we really did not think that this work would take that long or that it would be so complex. Having to work with approximately by then 150 to 180 authors became quite a task. To be in contact with all of them, to return articles to them with suggestions of editing, receiving the editing back from them, entering the corrections, back and forth. For some articles, we may have gone 2 or 3 times to the authors with suggestions. So it took a whole lot more time than we expected. And of course, also as time went on, the work began to grow from approximately 700 pages, 800 at the beginning. We ended up with a work that is over 1,400 pages right now. So the work was immense. It was long. It was bigger than we had anticipated, and so that was really part of the organization and the long-term process that we had to work with here.
Okay, so we're now at the January 2004, which was our final deadline if we were going to publish in 2005. And the natural reaction to giving up on the January 2004 deadline, just deciding that we were in a rush, we need to slow down, work carefully, and do something that we'd be happy with in the end. So a natural reaction was collapse. All the pressure was off. For a few weeks, we all turned to the neglected tasks we had put on our respective back burners during the all-consuming dash to completion. As we gradually resumed work on the encyclopedia, continued assembling the individual articles into alphabetical order, the incongruity of having 50 words on John Smith sandwiched between huge articles on heavy theological issues led us to consider putting the biographical entries in a separate section. Then someone suggested that by adding a few more biographical entries, we could include everyone Ellen White is known to have written a letter to. Michael headed to the Center for Adventist Research to see just how many people that would include. At this moment, we don't remember the exact number, but it was between 400 and 500. But we had quite a few of those in already, probably 150 or 200 already. So we assigned Michael to write the biographies not previously assigned. This decision, taken rather quickly, we justified by our resolve to make the book the best it could be. In hindsight, it was another factor that enlarged the book and contributed to the long development time. In any case, we still thought we could have the book ready for release in 2010 at the Atlanta General Conference session. In July 2006, Fortin listed all the articles not yet received, and they came to only 40. By now, we only 40 articles still unwritten. By now, we had lost our graduate assistant. Michael had taken full-time employment away from campus and was also writing a dissertation, so his ongoing involvement was limited from there on. During 2008 and 2009, we submitted the entire manuscript without the author identifications to peer reviewers, and then painstakingly worked through all the suggestions they made. By September 2009, a 1,500 manuscript page section of the peer-reviewed and re-edited manuscript had been sent to the Review and Herald, which left us somewhere around 400 pages of manuscript yet to go. However, because of the extensive cross-referencing, the review editors needed to have the entire book in hand to efficiently do the final editing. So through the final months of 2009, we scrambled to finish the rest of the pages. On December 21, we FedExed the biographical section to the Review and Herald. We were still hoping for a 2010 publication, but that was unrealistic. In February, we received word from the Review that publication had been postponed, at least for a year, and then in early 2011, the Review gave us a new final deadline of June 23, 2011, which we finally were able to meet with the last of the articles. We were surprised that the final editing took the review editors over 2 years, from January 2011 to September 2013. Several factors entered into it: the size of the book, thousands of source references, numerous cross-references, and the fact that in recent years the Review has had to greatly downsize its editorial staff. We were delighted when in April this year we received from the Review a mostly edited edition of the full manuscript for us to inspect and suggest corrections. Then in September we received the long-awaited page proofs for 1 week of examination, not for general revising or updating, but for identifying typographical errors. We do have a short list of items to revise or update, and the Review and Herald editors have assured us that we will have opportunity to do all of that before the electronic edition is released in a few months. Third part here is the outcome and how it differed from the original projections. The most obvious difference is the size, 1,465 pages, double the original projection of 704 pages. The front matter and the general articles comprise almost 20% of the total. The biographical section comprises another 20%. The topical section makes up about 50% of the entire book, and equal to the original size of the proposal. And then some appendices make up just over 10% of the pages. Denis will talk a little bit about the different sections.
One of the things that we decided to do in constructing the encyclopedia was to have the introductory sections, these general articles about Ellen White. And I think that as part of the encyclopedia, this is probably the section that has the most groundbreaking information that is being given to the readers. Just to go through very quickly through these articles, there's a very good article written by Jerry and one of our graduate assistant doctoral student at the seminary, Dennis Kaiser, on the life of Ellen White. It is quite long. It's about 80 pages long, and it is thorough, it is beautiful, and I think it is a very good synopsis of a biography of Ellen White. Another very good article is the one by George Knight, who does a survey of all the books of Ellen White by types. So council books or great controversy type books. Very well written by George. I'll skip a couple, then I'll come back to them. Judd Lake and Jerry also wrote a very beautiful essay on current science and Ellen White, 12 controversial statements. This is really what I find one of the most groundbreaking articles of the entire encyclopedia. This one is also a good one of about 30 pages. I wrote one on the theology of Ellen White. Hopefully it will be well received and will also help people understand the thought of Ellen White and putting it in context in her time. There are two articles in that introduction that I think were impacted by the delay of publication. Tim Poirier wrote an Archival Resources and Finding AIDS article. Had we known that this book would be delayed so long, I think we would have given Tim another chance of editing the work. But every time we talked to the review, they would tell us, no, it's coming up, it will be ready very soon, so we don't need to, we cannot take the time to edit articles. This one by Tim is affected a little bit by this delay. The same with Merlin Bird's article. Another one groundbreaking article is a bibliographic essay on publications about Ellen White, since from the beginning of Ellen White up to today. A beautiful and very long essay. But this one too, cut off approximately at the year 2006, 2009. If Merlin had had 2 or 3 more years to write, this would have been good just to update the article a little bit more. So the delay caused us a little bit of angst there with these articles. But I tell you, these are very beautiful articles from my perspective and will be very groundbreaking. Another good also about the encyclopedia is the appendices. At the very end, the White Estate allowed the Review and Herald to publish a complete list of Ellen White's letters and a complete list of Ellen White's manuscripts. All of the unpublished letters and manuscripts are listed at the end of the encyclopedia. So that's a beautiful resource to have in print. Jerry?
Okay.
Jerry, this is Tim.
Yes.
We probably need to wind up the next minute or two.
Okay. One difference in the final edition is that every article originally included an asterisk by every word in which there was an entry elsewhere in the encyclopedia. So there was an internal cross-referencing system with asterisks all through the articles. Eventually, the review editors felt that there were too many of them and they were distracting and should be eliminated. But this system was retained in the biographical section. So, for instance, the entry on page 485 for Carl Jacob Audison notes that he was the founder of Scodsburg Sanitarium. And the asterisk by Scodsburg tells you there's an entry elsewhere. However, remembering that there were once these asterisks all through the book, you may stop and think, when reading an article, if you come across an unfamiliar name and something that you don't know where to go for information, first try and look and see if there's an article on that topic in the encyclopedia, because quite a few of the references are that way. Okay, final paragraph. What does not differ from the original proposal is the goal of an accessible, authoritative, scholarly, peer-reviewed guide to everything known about Ellen White. It's the work of some 180 scholars, bibliographic lists after most of the articles. We believe that by systematizing existing knowledge about Ellen White, this book will provide a significant stimulus to further research. Most of all, we hope that people who never knew Ellen White, and a lot of people who thought they knew her, will find that there's a lot more to her than they realized. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to both of you. We are going to be, just for your information, we'll be scheduling our break at 2:45 instead of 2:30. We still have to squeeze in 2 presentations. Again, in the interest of knowing what the weather is like out there and potential for connections, electricity loss, and so forth, I would like to take just 3 minutes here now for any comments or questions for Jerry or Denis, and then we'll take the next presentation. Yes.
Has there been any thought of publishing those introductory articles as a separate volume?
I could give a thought on this one. My article on the theology of Ellen White, I have already talked with the review about expanding it a little bit and make it into a self-standing book, part of that collection that George Knight has published on Ellen White. I know that the one that Jerry and Dennis Kaiser wrote on the life and biography of Ellen White is just a beautiful one. And it would not take too much, I think, to expand it and to make it into a self-standing book. Merlin Burt's bibliography essay on Ellen White is just a major contribution. But it's a bibliographic essay. It's quite technical, but it's quite beautiful too at the same time. I guess those are my thoughts for now.
Okay, I agree. The biographical article, Dennis Kaiser has already been negotiating with a press in Europe to bring it out in German because they don't have a German biography of Ellen White of that brevity, and so he's working on that.
Okay, David?
Thanks to both, and especially for making the effort to connect electronically. I do think, I take the point that Merlin Burt's essay, because it's bibliographical, might be a little hard to find a publisher for, but it may be the sort of thing that we could include in the new JC Archive series, which are sort of scholarly, technical type works that deserve publication, might not otherwise receive it.
Oh, beautiful thought. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both.
Thank you both, and again, congratulations on its final publication, even if you haven't seen a copy yet. We've been enjoying it here.
Good afternoon. My paper is titled The Testimonies of the Spirit of God, looking at the testimonies for the church as interpretive key for understanding Ellen White's writings. And basically what I'm doing, while I was a pastor, I started reading through the testimonies. I focused on a lot of different things, but I found them incredibly relevant for a lot of the situations I dealt with in my own life as a pastor. And I started going through them very carefully, then starting to outline them, and then trying to characterize and describe them. And it's been a lot of fun. And so I'm hoping it's taken the shape in the form of a book. So I'm testing out some of my ideas here for the first time, and I'm looking forward to some feedback and trying to tell some of the stories, the untold stories. So I've tentatively titled the manuscript Rank and File, Extraordinary Visions, How Extraordinary Visions Have Impacted Ordinary People. Begin with significance of the testimonies for the church. Actually, I have a manuscript. If someone, Doug, if maybe you and Miguel could be so kind as to pass that out, I'd appreciate it. Significance of the testimonies for the church. The estimated 100,000 pages of Ellen G. White's writings is nothing short than staggering. At the time of her death, there were 24 books in circulation, a figure that expanded considerably to 130 publications a century later. I contend in this paper that the 9 volumes of the Testimonies for the Church, hereafter referred to as Testimonies in italics, and I describe in quotation marks her self-description of her visionary experience, quotations published between 1855 and 1909, as the most significant of her overall prophetic writings for 5 specific reasons. First, the sheer volume of the testimonies at 4,739 content pages makes it the largest single genre of her prophetic career. And incidentally, I couldn't find anywhere where I could actually track down the exact number of pages, so I had to count them myself. This effect is amplified somewhat by the simple fact that the various excerpts from testimonies were published both before and after as tracts and pamphlets, as well as the source for many of her later books and posthumous compilations, sometimes republished as many as 8 times. Now, while I am still in the process of tabulating this, I'm willing to give a cautious estimate that somewhere between 15 and 25%, again, this is a cautious estimate based on my research so far, more accurately shows just how extensive the testimonies are in terms of their sheer volume. Second, the scope of the testimonies encompasses virtually every major theological topic and lifestyle issue during her lifetime. In most instances, at pivotal early points, she describes her views of education, health reform, or the great controversy conflict, just to name a few examples. The testimonies furthermore demarcate significant shifts in her thinking, even though, of course, she develops each of these themes into other later and significant works in their own right. Thus, these later works are informed by her writings in the testimonies and sometimes even compiled from them. Third, Ellen G. White considered the testimonies by their very nature as proof of the genuineness of her prophetic authority. She describes the fact that the Bible describes the failures of great men and women of faith, as well as God's people collectively throughout salvation history, as the greatest sign of its inspiration. And by extension, she applied this to her own prophetic ministry and authority. It was her messages of reproof to friends as well as foe that denoted the genuineness of her prophetic authority. And when criticized by church leaders for being too forceful in her reproofs, she defended herself that if anything, she had not been severe enough. It was Satan who seeks to shake the confidence of God's people in the voice of warning and reproof, through which God designs to purify the church and prosper his cause. Thus, those who rebelled against such messages were in fact rebelling against the word of the Lord. By their very nature, the testimonies reprove sins and cherished idols, presenting people with a choice to either deny self or to reject them. Fourth, during Ellen White's lifetime, the testimonies were the most widely circulated of all her published writings. Beginning as a small tract in 1855, the first 10 pamphlets were reprinted as the last section of Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4, in 1864. They were republished in 1871, 1879, and then the first 30 pamphlets were bound as voted by the 1883 General Conference session into 4 volumes. Additional volumes were added up through 1909. Now, these volumes received wide circulation during her lifetime, as already mentioned. But even James White, at the time of his death in 1881, had just completed raising $10,000 to provide sets of the testimonies for church members who were poor, as well as church libraries. Perhaps this could at least partially explain why most Seventh-day Adventist churches, especially the older ones, are likely to have a set of the testimonies, if they have any of her writings at all. She urged that every Seventh-day Adventist family should own a set of the testimonies and have daily evening readings from them. Fifth, Ellen G. White regarded the testimonies as a covenant between herself and the Sabbatarian Adventist movement, and of course after 63, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, the first testimony pamphlet was the result of a significant spiritual revival in Battle Creek, Michigan in 1855. During the previous 3 years, James White refrained from publishing her views in the Review and Herald, the main Sabbatarian Adventist periodical. As the question arose about how to best circulate her visions, these early believers voted to distribute her visions in tract form. Thus, it was during the formative stages of what became the Seventh-day Adventist Church that mutual agreement became a sort of precedent covenant between God and the church over the prophetic gift. Thus, early Sabbatarian Adventists believed that her admonitions could benefit others. And the theme of modern Israel versus ancient Israel that I develop a little later in this paper is particularly illuminating with this regard. This is particularly the Exodus experience. Now, while she notes that God gave her messages of reproof, these messages were dependent to some degree to their collective acceptance of the counsel. This dynamic is evident in her warnings like this one. I was shown that God would not frequently point out the wrongs committed by his people. Now, this undocumented covenant was reaffirmed once again at the 1883 General Conference session, which may explain the practice as to why the General Conference, even today, continues in its regular business sessions to vote a reaffirmation of the prophetic gift. Now, in the rest of my paper, I attempt to give a broad overview of the testimonies that highlights the composition of their composition. I furthermore describe what I consider to be the most significant themes and reflect on the implications for hermeneutics along with some considerations for the future of Adventist studies. Now for the composition. Now, while I recognize the limitations of categories, we talked about those earlier, there do appear to be 5 overarching types contained within these testimonies, and I very carefully spent many hours tabulating this. So this is my first time actually publishing or sharing this here. I'm very excited because it's painstaking work, doing research sometimes. That of general counsel, 49%. Personal testimonies, 26%. Collective testimonies, 15%. Theological counsels, 6%. And narratives, 4%. Now, within these categories, Ellen White employs a wide variety of literary devices. Personal and collective testimonies are primarily letters written to either individuals or groups of people, like a family. Other testimonies are sermons or public addresses, and in a few instances she quotes from other individuals, such as John Madison's dream that she viewed as confirming her prophetic ministry. Now, in other instances, she has the reader of the testimonies in mind directly, as she's commenting almost parenthetically to future subsequent readers. Other times, the testimonies read like a travel diary, as she references extensive passages from her earlier ministry to buttress later arguments. Overall, the testimonies are incredibly rich and diverse. Now, this general admonition from Ellen White is counsel of a broad nature that applies to the collective church. Such admonitions tend to focus on a specific topic that she believes the church needs to pay attention to, such as education, health reform, dress reform, the need for health and educational institutions, and so on. Although they tend to be specific, they have broad application. An example is Ellen White's plain testimony about ministers, which was written in the wake of Nathan Fuller's apostasy. Now, this is interesting because it's the longest single testimony in the entire testimonies, in which she, it just drips from the page. You can just imagine. She describes herself trembling and literally that her confidence in humanity had been shaken. She says that several times. Now, Fuller was a serial philanderer who left the denomination after an affair came to light. And if you want to know more about his story, you have to get the Ellen White Encyclopedia. Thus, it makes sense that Ellen White counseled to ministers in general about moral integrity. Now, in contrast, letters of admonition collectively make up the second largest category, 41%. And within this category, I've subdivided it into personal admonitions to a specific person or family, 26%, versus a testimony to a group of families or a church, about 15%. I realize that's somewhat subjective, but you get some kind of feel as you're reading through it, and so I've tried to delineate the two. Now, examples of the first are her admonitions to Ken, Wright, and Kellogg, and you're going through and you're trying to, not all of them are 100% slam dunks in terms of their identification. So it's hard to say for sure, but I give them a tie as to which one Ellen White sent the personal admonitions the most in the testimonies. I tell you plainly, God is displeased with your course. That's a classic example of this testimonies of reproof. Now, between the two of them, within the here, as a second example of the second is her counsels to the church in Battle Creek, a little typo there, Michigan, the headquarters of the denomination. Every volume of the testimonies has some form of admonition addressed to this specific congregation. From Ellen White's perspective, it was an extremely troubled congregation that caused her no end of grief. Now, the final two categories are a significant minority, her theological counsels and narratives. And Ellen White clearly wrote about the Bible and theology throughout the testimonies, of course, but some are so direct and unique that I provided a separate category. The largest portion of these counsels is biblical expositions, of which the majority focuses on the life of Jesus Christ. Skipping down to line 5. Last but not least, this autobiographical narrative, again, very minor, especially very early on in her life. She is describing her experience, but at a few later junctures, she does share autobiographical, these narratives, especially in the 1870s, where she's describing her life. But most of this has been published elsewhere in the review, so it's not particularly new. It serves an apologetic function in relationship to telling her experience in relationship to other crises. So that's what that's about. Now, the composition is diverse, but also contains some overarching themes. I'll delve into the major themes. Ellen White addressed specific issues that changed with time. Students in my classes on Ellen White and Adventist history frequently remark that no one person could possibly have all the problems addressed in the testimonies. It's to state the obvious also that Ellen White grew in her understanding. Yet I would also contend that there does appear to be consistent themes that are pervasive throughout the testimonies. And I believe it's these themes that help us to better appreciate how she viewed the testimonies, as well as her own prophetic ministry. Key theological idea, the one that stands out the most, at least to me, is God's love for human beings. Consistently from her early counsels to the end of her life, she laced even the sternest admonitions with hope made possible through God's redemptive love. And I should probably add to that, through the death and sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. I mean, just again and again, she's appealing to people, look to Jesus, look to Jesus. One example here, God loves your family. And I love this one particular letter. She just writes, "Dear brother, God loves you." Frequently, she begins her testimonies with a reminder of God's personal interest in them. Such admonitions were furthermore an evidence of God's love. She also extended love from the divine human to the relationships between human beings. Self-sacrificing love should characterize all human relationships. Thus, she more often rebuked church members for their failure to lovingly observe Adventist lifestyle requirements and prioritize relationships over requirements, although she ultimately says that love and duty are inseparable. Now, I'm going to summarize this next part here just very briefly on the visual aspects of the testimonies. Graham Sherrick's done some work. I haven't been able to cite it because the book that Ron and others are editing hasn't been published, but actually Graham and I have had some great interactions the last few months, challenging each other on different ideas, and he essentially is arguing that she was a very visual prophet, and I kind of discovered this, and then we started dialoguing together, and so we kind of both agree that her visions were very visual experience, and very much an encounter of light versus darkness. And so I find that very interesting. And she describes people as being spiritually blind or in darkness, groping in darkness. So you can check out the citations and read that later. I need to move on for the sake of time. Line 21 on page 7, a unifying theological narrative is ancient versus modern Israel, which Ellen White believed was the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In her first vision, she described herself as playing a role similar to the biblical Caleb and Joshua who scouted out the promised land. She later observed, the history of the children of Israel was written for the benefit of those who live in the last days, that they may avoid following their example of unbelief. She believed that the history of the 12 spies had special application to Adventists awaiting for the second coming. She also referred to her husband, James White, who had a role similar to Moses, as Moses was to Israel, although she later cautioned that he was not actually Moses, but that was simply a comparison. It kind of caused a little bit of controversy for a while. She described the importance of health reform for early Adventists within this frame of reference. Adventists who claim the Ten Commandments have a responsibility to observe natural laws, similar to the children of Israel. Thus, health reform served a role for modern Israel to prepare a fit people who are ready for the second advent, because heaven is all health. Another notable and consistent theme is that of urgency. Ellen White firmly believed the second coming of Jesus would occur within her lifetime. She understood and saw her world as living within the perils of the last days. And I'm going to skip on to page 9 here just a little bit, but you get the sense she's appealing people, make a decision, make a decision. You don't know how much time you may have. You could die. Make a decision for Christ. There's a sense of urgency. Line 11, page 9. In what ways, I asked this question to sort of move along, in what ways did these testimonies impact, these themes, these narratives, impact ordinary believers in the pew? The testimonies provide a window into the world of everyday Adventists in the 19th century. Yet compared to her other writings, they've received almost no serious study. Now, the one major area in which I would make revisions to my contributions to the Ellen White Encyclopedia. You heard about how graduate students get, assigned various responsibilities, and that was mine. If I could revise my articles now, if I had an opportunity, what I would do is, I have so many numerous references and changes, because I would tell not only the story of the unpublished writings, but connect them to the testimonies, the ones I've been able to identify, because then you're making the links, and you start seeing more of the story, more of the color of Adventist history. You see it coming alive. And I believe in the future this will be one of the most fruitful areas for grasping Ellen White's cultural impact within her own lifetime, how ordinary believers understood her. Now, traditional Adventist historiography focuses on the interplay between Ellen White and the core leadership of the denomination. Yet I believe that, as just stated, some of talking about this lived religion that's so predominant, ASCH, those of you that were at the meetings this weekend, is focusing on these ordinary individuals. Anyways, moving on. Okay. Line 16 of page 10, another important aspect upon which little is written is that the testimonies also reveal the perceived impact of the prophetic gift upon herself. She consistently describes within the testimonies that she is doing this work out of a strict sense of duty. The law of duty is supreme, she says. She also felt her own inadequacy to share her prophetic messages with others. At times she knows that she only has time to dwell on the most essential things shown to me. Now sometimes while she spoke in public, she would see people in the audience whom she had seen in vision, yet at other times she was only able to address a specific individual at a church and recognize that she could no longer remember who the other people were. Other times she rebuked a church but could not remember their names. They needed to take the counsel and apply it to themselves. And in still yet other instances, Ellen White recognized people in the audience but refrained from admonishing them because of the presence of unbelievers. She did not want to negatively tarnish their spiritual encounter. Yet one does grasp within the testimonies a sense that she felt the prophetic mantle was at times a heavy burden. She was particularly bothered that some had gone so far as to burn the written word of rebuke and warning. Such opposition, like biblical prophets, should be expected from her viewpoint, yet it took its toll on her health, and she mentions on a number of occasions her struggle with insomnia and depression, and at other times it could still have a positive impact, not just a negative, but a positive impact, particularly when she claimed divine healing. Now, the hermeneutics, I'm just going to summarize that for the sake of time, but the bottom line is Ellen White is articulating as she interprets and reinterprets her writings throughout her lifetime. She is providing a hermeneutical framework, a hermeneutical key, if you please, for how to understand, how to interpret her writings. And so, in essence, after her death, you have what's been described in many places as the Red Books. There's even been a play on this, the Red Books. But Ellen White's testimonies, interestingly, have never been published in red. They've always been black. And so I argue, in essence, that maybe the black books should interpret the red books. And so now I recognize there's a broad genre of her writings and that all of them need to be considered. But as she develops this hermeneutic, I find over and over again she's articulating that people need to look to Jesus. People need to prioritize Scripture. And when they don't do that, they run into problems. And so she addresses all kinds of personalities and situations, but she comes up with sort of a pragmatic hermeneutic, if you please. Now, that since so little has been done on the testimonies, I highlight this in my conclusion on page 14. Obviously, Graham Sherrick has written a chapter in this book that's going to come out. There's a little bit that's been done by Paul Gordon. Now that there's even a lot of attention on the unpublished writings, there's the annotation project, and I've talked with Tim before about this together, that it's actually kind of surprising that no work has been done on the testimonies, considering that there's so much readily accessible already, and their importance from her own standpoint for the reasons that I stated in my introduction. All of her writings are important, but I would suggest to you today the black books should interpret the red books. Thank you.
At the dawn of 1889, Charles Marshall Kinney packed his bags once again and looked east to the bustling port city of 500,000 that was St. Louis. For the last 4 years, the lone itinerant preacher had crisscrossed the state of Kansas, the grueling undertaking of colporteuring and preaching paying off in the form of pockets of black believers in Wichita, Emporia, and Topeka. Born into slavery in the capital of Virginia in 1855, at the time he and his family were emancipated, Charles's wanderlust could finally be satiated. Swept up in the crowds in search of gold, the young man went west, finding employment in the mining boomtown of Reno, Nevada. It was there in the late summer of 1878 that Kinney discovered the Adventist message under a tent through the preaching of John Loughborough and Ellen White. When he was baptized, Kinney was one of literally a dozen or so black Adventists. After proving himself in a church clerkship and as secretary of the Nevada Tract and Missionary Society, Charles was sponsored by the members of the Reno Church to study for the ministry at Healdsburg College in 1883. Upon finishing in 1885, he was sent by the General Conference to Canvas, Kansas. An Adventist minister with 3 strikes against him: minority race, minority religion, and minority marital status for an individual of his age. He was single. Charles was anything if not grimly persistent. Apprising Adventist Review readers of his progress, he penned modest pieces detailing modest successes. In total, Kinney won about 24 souls to the faith in Bleeding, Kansas. During this time, GC Secretary Dan Jones wrote to Kinney that, quote, "Your success or failure will largely shape the policy of the General Conference in planning for the work among the colored people in the future." Jones was not exaggerating. Kinney was basically the only black Adventist minister. Entering St. Louis, Kinney couldn't know that the next couple of months would signal a turning point in the history of the fledgling denomination. The indefatigable 34-year-old won a number of blacks of a fine class, those are Dan Jones's words, to the Adventist message there. But when the new believers, still in the blush of their fresh faith, arrived at the all-white congregation of 50 in the city, they were treated reprehensibly by their Caucasian brothers and sisters. Although Kinney's letters from 1889 have not survived, we get a feel for the sorry episode from a Dan Jones letter and Ellen White, who later visited the congregation. Kinney, for his part, departed the city for Louisville, Kentucky shortly afterward, and it is unclear whether he left because of the prejudice toward him and his converts, or in line with the early Adventist tradition, was simply moving on to evangelize in another locale. Later that year in October, Kinney was ordained, the first black to be thus honored in the Adventist church. And the face of white supremacy appeared to haunt him again at the ceremony, the gathering being segregated. Kinney deemed treatment like this as such an impediment to his mission to his people that subsequently he recommended the 2 races minister separately, maintain separate churches, and separate conferences, all to best advance the Advent cause. The next year in late March, Ellen White stopped at the gateway to the west on her way to a camp meeting in Kansas. From her reaction to the situation in the St. Louis church, it is evident that the ill treatment had not abated. On March 21, 1891, in an address to the GC leaders at the tail end of the GC session that year, White recalled, "While at St. Louis a year ago, as I knelt in prayer, these words were presented to me as if written were with a pen of fire, all ye are brethren. The Spirit of God rested upon me in a wonderful manner, and matters were open to me in regard to the church at St. Louis and in other places. The spirit and words of some in regard to members of the church were an offense to God. They were closing the door of their hearts to Jesus. Among those in St. Louis who believe the truth, there are colored people who are true and faithful, precious in the sight of the God of heaven, and they should have just as much respect as any of God's children. Those who have spoken harshly to them or have despised them have despised the purchase of the blood of Christ, and they need the transforming grace of Christ in their own hearts, that they may have the pitying tenderness of Jesus toward those who love God with all the fervor of which they themselves are capable. The color of the skin does not determine character in the heavenly courts." 15 years after the episode, Ellen White wrote to her son Edson, "I am free to say that the Lord does not call upon me to take upon myself the burden of doing pioneer work in a place where there have been Sabbath keepers for years, and when there are two classes of believers, white and colored." We had some experiences at St. Louis that I can never think of without a feeling of dread. In a letter to a couple called Evans, White wrote, "At St. Louis, the state of our missions was revealed to me like a flash of lightning, making everything distinct that was in darkness. I was bearing a testimony, clear and cutting to men and women in responsible places." As the above quotes attest, St. Louis triggered something in the mind of Ellen White. You may know that White's special emphases, from publishing to education to the health work, were frequently ignited by a vision or traumatic experience. In 1865, at the GC session, after the emancipation of the black captives, it was resolved that a field, quoting, that a field is now opened in the South for labor among the colored people and should be entered upon according to our ability. This resolution did not prompt a mad dash south from the ministers present. No, the period from 1865 to the St. Louis episode was characterized by tepid and piecemeal forays into the South by the largely Northern and Midwestern white Adventists. And Ellen White was quiet, at least publicly and in correspondence, on this neglect up to 1891. It is no mystery as to what initiated a veritable onslaught from her on the absolute necessity of a vigorous program of education and evangelism by Adventists to the 5 or so million blacks in the South. It was a traumatic experience coupled with a vision. In the 20 years that followed St. Louis, Ellen White wrote some 600 pages on the necessity of the church evangelizing Southern blacks, as well as raised money, gave talks, extracted promises, politicked, campaigned, and even supported her son when he embarked on his hazardous and ill-fated foray into the Deep South. Much of this, inexplicably, when she resided in Australia, a world away from the American South. Her burden for the black work was so considerable that she would provide for it from the grave. Clause 5 of her last will and testament, allotting monies to the Negro Department and Oakwood. St. Louis, and I'm using the city as a synecdoche, served as a mirror at the cusp of the inauguration of White's new burden. The episode revealed the true character of the Adventist Church, African Americans, and Ellen White. In St. Louis, we see a black minister winning blacks to the message, the said converts desiring fellowship, only to be refused. We glimpse a white church which did nothing to win the blacks who had accepted the message and not ready for fellowship. Finally, there is a prophetess who seems somewhat unaware of racial dynamics among Adventists, at least in certain regions, and is transformed by trauma and a subsequent revelation into a vocal advocate of racial equality and missions to African Americans. The three-way relationship from 1890 to 1910, halved by the inauguration of the 20th century, captures each entity at a compelling juncture in their development. First, Ellen White. Her husband James had died in 1881. We may say that after this, she truly came into her own, becoming a force as never before. You even recall that Stephen Haskell proposed to her and she said no, for these reasons. By then, her prophetic role was almost institutionalized. And although it was still attacked, e.g. 1888, the proving days were largely over. Because of this, at least partly, the last 25 years of White's life were arguably her most productive. next African Americans. Emancipation left some 3 million blacks bound one day and manumitted the next, with no place to go, no job, no money, no shelter, no food, and no education. To make matters worse, new varieties of slavery quickly emerged. Lynching was common, and other kinds of racial terrorism haunted the everyday lives of blacks. Largely illiterate and uneducated, as well as being psychologically ravaged by slavery, this was an era of crisis for African Americans. The need was tremendous. Some historians posit unprecedented in history on such a large scale. From 1890 to 1910, Jim and Jane Crow policies were woven into the fabric of American society, the effects of which are still being felt today, despite the civil rights movement and claims of a post-racial Obama era. And the Adventist Church. By 1890, the church's membership was just at 30,000. And although it couldn't be called an international church yet, very modest foundations that would eventually support a robust multinational church presence were being laid in locales across the globe. From 1881 to 1890, the church dispatched 149 missionaries. The deployment of this amount of IDEs indicates something of the level of the church's establishment and administrative competency. And although the 1880s were tempestuous with the winds that any young organization faces, the denomination entered the 1890s forward-facing. On the flip side are those tempestuous winds, the identity crisis post-1888, and indeed the aftermath of 1888, saw all of the major feuding participants dispersed across the globe. There was also the reorganization of 1901, the Review and Herald Fire, the relocation of the GC, the Review to Washington, D.C., and the apostasy of A.T. Jones and J.H. Kellogg. Now, there are 9 permutations in the tripartite relationship in which I'm using the mirror as metaphor. And since I am in the Ellen White section, the program, and have a time restraint, I will only treat on Ellen White's catalytic aspect in this relationship. We have Ellen White to blacks to the church. And then we're going to look at Ellen White to the church to blacks. Ellen White to blacks to the church. Ellen White to the church to blacks. These 2 permutations represent a lens for the first entity, Ellen White, that becomes a mirror to the third entity. That is to say, Ellen White related to the church through the lens of the black predicament. And the church saw itself in the mirror. Further, Ellen White had a relationship with blacks through the lens of the Adventist church, and blacks could see themselves on the other end. I paused before wading into these chilling waters. In my research on Ellen White's appeals to the church to work for blacks from 1890 to 1910, and the church's response to her, I discovered that the whole 2-decade affair is overwhelmingly negative, to the point of being depressing. To be frank, Ellen White was brutal toward the church in their response, or lack thereof, castigating and upbraiding it, and even accusing certain leaders of fraud, misappropriation, and outright embezzlement of funds earmarked for the Southern work. Now, I love my church, but the evidence shows that there was a tragic disconnect, not only between the church and Ellen White on this matter, but the church and African Americans. I found myself craving the comforts of the good old triumphalist narrative. But there's no triumphalism in the documents, none in this part of history. I hope the rest of this presentation will be instructive for us that the Christological imperative toward the least of these, in the end, is what the churches and our personal evaluation will hinge on. The first permutation. Ellen White often related to the Adventist church through or in light of black people. To illustrate this dynamic, listen to a line from Ellen White's 1891 address, Our Duty to the Colored People. I'm quoting, "Sin rests upon us as a church because we have not made greater effort for the salvation of souls among the colored people." Here, White reveals the church, represented in the person of its leaders, to itself through black people. In this case, what Adventists had not done for them. Sin is resting on the church. The church is guilty. Mark that, for our purposes here, such a conclusion could only have been made through or in light of blacks. As an aside, I find it disconcerting that certain voices in Adventism and on its fringe have declared that sin rested on the church due to its supposed rejection of the 1888 message. But the aforementioned Ellen White statement, more direct than any statement she made on the church's guilt over 1888, gets nary a mention. In this next pericope from a 1901 letter, we see that through blacks, the church sees in the mirror that it may claim to adhere what God says through his prophet, but in fact does not when she bears a message that is disagreeable. I'm quoting, "I know not how to describe the way in which the Southern field has been presented to me. In this field, thousands and thousands of people are living in wickedness and corruption, and they are right within the shadow of our doors. That field bears testimony to the neglect of a people who should have been wide awake to work for the master, but who have done scarcely anything in this field. A little work has been done there. We have touched the field with the tip ends of our fingers. But not 1,000th part of the work has been done that should be done." God calls upon his people to stand in a right position before him, to heed the light given 10 or 15 years ago, that the abused, downtrodden people of the South were to be labored for and helped. Listen to this, and I'm quoting again. "What excuse can be rendered to God for the awful condition of the colored people? God asks, why are those living in this part of my vineyard left to become the sport of Satan's temptations? He calls for universal action. Angels have hushed the music of their harps as they have looked upon a people unable, because of their past slavery, to help themselves. And yet those who have the torch of truth, kindled from the divine altar, have not carried the light to this sin-darkened field. I present this subject to you as it has been presented to me. There are those who have turned from the work of rescuing the downtrodden and degraded. They have refused to help the helpless. Let the servants of Christ now act their part in the way that seems to open before them. Let them begin at once to redeem their neglect. Let the gospel message ring through our churches, summoning them to universal action, that the dark stain of neglect on their record may be wiped out." Yes, the premise of almost every one of Ellen White's statements to the church about the South, and once again, South is a synecdoche meaning the evangelization of blacks, is that this is the Adventist Church's non-negotiable mission. As the remnant of Revelation, who's tasked with proclaiming the gospel at every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, they must reach blacks with the message. This I see as the profound mistake of the Millerite and shut door periods. How can Jesus come or probation be closed when blacks in the South and people across the world have not heard the glad tidings? Ellen White assures the church time and time again that there is no way around the Great Commission. There is no ducking it. Yet also implicit in her statements is that the work can indeed be accomplished. God is not setting his people up for failure. I conclude this very limited exploration on a positive note, since it seems that the degradation of blacks just after slavery has been such a prevalent theme. Our second relationship path, Ellen White related to blacks through the church. Now I can demonstrate this in a number of ways, but for now I'm going to share one angle. Ellen White viewed blacks through the lens of her distinctly Adventist worldview, and blacks could look at her statements and see in the mirror what they were and what they could be. Follow me. On the mental capacity of blacks. On the mental capacity of blacks. And this sounds demeaning and inappropriate for discussion now, but when White wrote the following in 1905, it was not only up for discussion, but heated debate, with perhaps the majority of white Americans arguing against. Let's move on. Also note that if these quotes sound somewhat paternalistic or patronizing, it is because this is still the Victorian era. Listen to this. White pens, there are among the Negro race those who have superior natural intelligence, and who, if converted to Christ, could do a work for their own people. Many are to be trained to labor as evangelists, Bible workers, teachers, nurses, hygienic cooks, and call porters. Many can be taught to be home missionaries. She says some blacks have superior mental intelligence, and no doubt this is most clearly seen in the performance of some sort of Adventist ministry function. Black intelligence is recognized in Ellen White's worldview in church-related ethnic labor in order to achieve the raison d'etre of her church. Here, blacks can see in the mirror that, despite what whites have programmed them to think about themselves for centuries, they were just as intelligent and occupied a place in God's plan. In this next quote, White's Adventist eschatology informs her thinking about blacks, and I'm quoting, "The powers of hell are working with all their ingenuity to prevent the proclamation of the last message of mercy among the colored people," end quote. The larger context of this statement is a cataloging of the tremendous degradation that blacks suffered from their enslavement to the present racial terrorism of the post-Reconstruction South. This, the Sturm und Drang, was a strategy of satanic agencies to prohibit them from hearing the gospel. Blacks were facing a cunning foe, fixated on preventing them from fulfilling their eschatological destiny. This is a look in the mirror that perhaps only an Adventist prophetess could provide. I've never seen it anywhere else. In fact, in the 1850s, John Andrews and Uriah Smith identified the United States as the eschatological villain of Revelation 13, the lamb-like beast who spoke as a dragon, because of its cruel treatment of blacks via chattel slavery. Blacks were integral to the prominent features of Adventist eschatology, and this look in the mirror placed their harrowing American sojourn in divine perspective. One more passage on African Americans and the eschaton. Here, the last judgment. I'm quoting, "In the eyes of the Lord, the southern field is a most distressing spectacle, a deformity in the midst of a Christian nation, bearing testimony before angels and before men to the neglect of a people who might be helped were it not for the selfishness and covetousness of professing Christians, who will be called to account for the neglect in the day when every man is judged according to his works." The colored people of the South, who have been left in degradation, will then bear witness against the Christian world. Finally, in the following lines, Ellen White's notion of Adventist perfectibility and the limitless potential of man through the power of the gospel is applied to Black Americans. I quote, "They may have a life that measures with the life of God. Many among this race have noble traits of character and keen perception of mind. If they had an opportunity to develop, they would stand upon an equality with the whites." That's Ellen White. I'm quoting again. "Many who have been looked upon as hopeless will become educators of their race. Through the grace of God, the race of the enemy has for generations oppressed may rise to the dignity of God-given manhood and womanhood. To many of the colored people, God has given rare and precious talents. And finally, Ellen White said to the Oakwood students in 1904, God has bestowed on the colored race some of the best and highest talents. In conclusion, we see Charles Kinney in 1951, aged 96. He is haggard and stooped, ambulating when he deigns to with a cane, with the assistance of a cane. He is curmudgeonly by even the most generous estimate. But the network of creases hollowed on his visage approximate the trails and roads he traversed to touch blacks with the truth. This man who offered his life in the gospel field in an often thankless work was one among only a handful of black Adventists upon his conversion in 1878, and now, the year of his death, there are nearly 27,000 African American Seventh-day Adventists. Indeed, after World War II, when regional conferences were formed, the black church was a paragon of prodigious soul winning for global Adventism, outstripping even their white American brethren in this regard. Times had changed, and now there was an altogether different image staring back in the mirror.
Thank you to both of you gentlemen, and to Denis again, and Jerry, if you're still listening. We have a few minutes for questions, comments. Yes, and again, remind each of you as you speak to please identify yourself. Thank you.
Zach Plantak, Washington Adventist University. Benjamin, thank you for a fantastic paper. Really deeply appreciated the study that you've done on this. I have a very minor question regarding the statement that Ellen White made that is often quoted, and she's regarded at times because of that statement by some of our students is, a racist. I mean, there are many other statements I'm sure that could be quoted, but this one regarding the separation of the work. And did I understand you correctly that it's Charles Kinney who actually had that concept in the 1880s, and would it be sensible to think that maybe she appreciated what was being done, she was very impacted by that trauma in St. Louis, that maybe she actually borrowed that concept from him later on when she mentioned it?
Sure, I think that's entirely possible. In fact, there were many black leaders who, because of the ill treatment, the racist treatment, recommended the separation of the work. And of course, when her son went to the South in 1894, 1895, because he had first had a policy of integration with the blacks, they were almost run out of Mississippi. I mean, there were instances of gunfire and whippings and just violent episodes because of their attempt to not segregate, to integrate. And so from this context, Ellen White, in order to forward the work of the church and to save the lives of her son and the rest of the Southern Missionary Society, she recommended segregation as an expedient.
Just a quick follow-up. I gather from Ellen White's instruction on that point, she's thinking more external prejudice, but you alluded to the internal prejudice. Was Kinney's motivation more internal or external?
Kinney's motivation was internal. Obviously, when his converts were brought to the church in St. Louis, because of their recent conversion, they were fledgling Christians, and this situation potentially could drive them away from the church. And so he was saying, this is just unacceptable. I mean, we can't, let alone the black work thrive I'm not even sure the new converts will stay in this kind of environment. Yes, Bill, Bagel.
I noticed, this question is for our brothers at Andrews. I noticed in the, looking through the encyclopedia, and, oh, I didn't introduce myself, Bill Fagel, White Estate. I noticed that some of the topical entries were not attributed. They had no author's name after them. Can you just tell us what, what that represents then?
If you would tell me the exact headings, I could tell you. In a few cases, the entries were sufficiently controversial that nobody really wanted to take responsibility for it. So
That's right.
the basically unsigned articles are by the editors. So in the biographical section, all of the unsigned articles, or most of them in the biographical section, are by Michael Campbell. In the topical section, the unsigned articles are mostly by Denis and I. Sometimes they were written by somebody else, but by the time we finished editing, they changed their viewpoint so much that they really didn't have any contact with the originator, so we just left them unsigned. Don't remember now exactly. There weren't too many of them.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Another thought, perhaps just to complete the thought here, is that most of the unsigned articles are under 250 words. And they're the very small ones. Oftentimes, 2 or 3 editors worked on these just to complete them. And there were so many of them that we just decided also, that was one of the points of decisions we had, just the length of the articles made them so small. And so we decided to have them unsigned.
Yes, there were, when another author with some special expertise worked on those short ones, we generally gave credit, but if we had to do it ourselves, rather than have our names sprinkled through the encyclopedia at every turn, we decided to leave them unsigned.
Okay, David?
Well, first I can affirm the 2 editors in it. After all, the long-standing editorial practice of the Review and Herald was that if the article was unsigned, it was by the editor, so you're in the good company of James White and Uriah Smith there. A question to Michael, an area that was in the paper but you left for time, talking about the study of lived religion, which, as you say, has been a major part of the historiography of certainly American religious history, but there's barely any in Adventist historiography. But you say there is no better way to grasp that than through the testimonies, and I'd just like to, is that a rhetorical overstatement? Do you really think that? Because it seems to me that
No,
that's not really that. I would if that's your view, I'm really not persuaded by that.
Well, I think in terms of traditional Adventist historiography, I don't know if how far that would go completely to satisfy everyone in ASDH or whatever, but I think it would make a huge stride in that direction at the very least. And part of that, and I left it out for sake of time, but I'm really impressed with how Ellen White deals with, and I cite on page 10, the beginning there, how Ellen White writes a testimony to a child, So she's not just writing to General Conference leaders. There is some of that in there, but there's I would say the majority of the testimonies are to ordinary people. And, one of the fun stories I identified was an orphan boy. I was able to find out who he was. His older sister was D.M. Kenwright's wife. And amazing story, close friends of Ellen White. The family died, the parents died, and tracked down his descendants, found pictures, the rest of his story. And it's an amazing story of a young teenager growing up in Battle Creek. And he ended up leaving the church, but still it's an amazing story. And how it's harder, it's easier to track the people that accepted the testimonies. One of the ways I started out in this project was reading through the Review and Herald, all the confessions. Well, that only accounts for part of the story. Some of the people did confess and repent, but not everybody did. So what about the stories of people that rejected the message? What happened to them? And so pastors' spouses, for example, I don't hear hardly anything about them, but I actually identify several pastoral spouses. I'd never heard of them before. Another example, a mute missionary to the mutes. Great stories. This is anywhere in Adventist historiography. A woman abused by her intoxicated husband. And one of my favorites, since I have young children, Ellen White, one of her sternest testimonies was to a husband that was not being very sensitive to his wife while she was nursing their child. You get a dimension of not only her as a prophet, but as a woman. And so I really think that the testimonies, as the more I unpack them, I'm starting to get a sense of what it was like to really be an Adventist and not to be a prominent church leader, but to...
Right. I would, if you rephrase it as make a considerable stride, I would go along with that. The problem is that these are not from the people's point of view. They are written by somebody who, by definition, is extraordinary and unique to them. I agree. I think it's a very clever and original methodology to try and take that to get into those. But it does seem to me that the only note, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I think it's a wonderful idea. What I'm saying as a note of caution is to say that this is the way to understand the lived experience of an ordinary Adventist, because there are other ways to do that which reflect their point of view rather than the prophet's point of view.
I would completely agree. And so, yes, this shows the perspective of Ellen White. But once you can identify the person, then you can start looking for new sources to get their story. And that's what I'm trying to get after. And my book is going to tell 21 stories from that perspective.
Very quick question. We have a couple more. Again, I don't know how much time we want to intrude onto the next section. All right. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is Dr. Baker. In terms of Mrs. White's view of the struggle here with the black congregations, I'm wondering how much her travels in other countries and living in other countries influence her whole view, because here she lives overseas for quite a while and is seeing how other people interact. And what is interesting is that one of the very few times that Sister White wrote to anyone in the Caribbean, she wrote to the folk in Barbados, to the King Street Church, the mother church there. There was a controversy whereby there were leaders of the church who felt that people needed to take their shoes off before they come into the church. And also that people, when prayer is offered, all eyes should be closed. And so this pastor wanted her to comment on this. Her comment shows her appreciation for other people's culture. She did not make a judgment, but she said that there's nothing right or wrong about this, but you have to look at the context of how the people in Barbados felt. And she was writing this to the missionary who was in charge of the church, who felt that these things should not be done.
That's an excellent question you pose. And for purposes of time constraints, I would only remark that her traveling convinced her more than ever that Adventists were doubly guilty for not evangelizing people right in their backyard. She often spoke of the church doing missions in all these far-flung lands, but their business at home was undone. So I would like to get into your question more, but that's just my...
Thank you very much.
I think this is as far as we should stretch it. I'm jealous of people's times to come here this afternoon. Thank you again for all the participants, and we were much blessed by it.